This is my view from the DoubleTree in Wellington. I believe the high in Fahrenheit is about 56, and the forecast is scattered showers throughout the day, which is fine with me because I'm sick. It seems oddly appropriate that I got sick on this trip because Bilbo also got a cold on his first adventure with the dwarves. Of course I got a cold on my Hobbit adventure because the Hobbit himself got sick on his first adventure.
I made it, y'all. Welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for continuing this journey with me across New Zealand. It was quite a long trip, but much longer trip than I've ever taken before. Covered a lot of ground, did a lot of really fun things, got to see a lot of cool things across both islands of New Zealand, but there was still a lot I didn't get to do. I feel like that's a theme for pretty much any vacation, regardless of how long or how short or where you are, anything like that. There's always going to be something you're not able to see. I'd reached about the halfway point of my itinerary. The plan was to head north from Christchurch to the Nelson area, spend a couple nights in Nelson, and take a day trip to Abel Tasman National Park. But that's not quite what happened. The morning I left Christchurch to head to Nelson, I could feel a cold coming on. And I said, you know what? I'm not gonna worry about it too much. I have nothing except this very long bus ride planned for today, and hopefully that'll be enough to kick the cold so I'll still be able to have my fun day trip to Abel Tasman. But the next morning in Nelson, I woke up with a full-fledged cold. There was absolutely no way I was going out on a boat in the cold to see the national park. I really just needed to lay low and rest as much as possible because the heater in my room wasn't really all that reliable and the hot water in my room was almost non-existent, and I couldn't really do what I'd come to Nelson to do anyway. I decided to just bail on Nelson and head on to my next destination in Wellington. The problem was that the bus network that goes to Nelson doesn't run on Tuesday, and I had carefully arranged my itinerary around not having public transportation on Tuesday. Luckily for me, Nelson does have a small airport that does have daily flights to different places around New Zealand. So bright and early that morning, I headed down to the Nelson airport and jumped on a morning flight to Wellington.
I just arrived in Wellington International Airport, which seems oddly appropriate because this is where I was going to fly into on the original trip anyway, so this is kind of oddly appropriate.
On my original trip that I was going to take back in 2020, I had planned to fly into Wellington and only travel around the North Island. So it was really cool to still be able to see Wellington Airport, even though that wasn't where I was originating my trip from anymore. Wellington is the capital city of New Zealand. The capital of New Zealand kind of bounced between different locations on North and South Island before they finally just said, you know what? Wellington is the most central location. Let's just make that our capital city. Wellington was named after Sir Arthur Wellesley, who was the first Earl of Wellington and also renowned for his victory at the Battle of Waterloo, clear on the other side of the world. Wellington is also the home base of Sir Peter Jackson, director of the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit movies. His Stone Street studio, which is used by many directors now, is in Wellington, as is Weta Workshop that does all of the props, figurines, models, costumes. The Hobbit feet were designed by them, all the prop swords were designed by them. They've had a hand in several hundred Hollywood productions, not just the Lord of the Rings movies. And because of this, it's not really surprising that there are life-size figurines of Gandalf and Gwahir the Lord of the Eagles hanging from the ceiling at the Wellington Airport domestic terminal. So I showed up at my hotel in Wellington a full day and a half early. So I got checked in, took a nice warm shower, and then basically just slept for a day and a half. By my second full day in Wellington, I was feeling much better and decided I could probably go ahead with the activities that I had planned for that day. I didn't really have anything too crazy or strenuous planned for that first day in Wellington, so I figured what the heck, I'll be fine. The first activity I had planned was early access to the Gallipoli, the Scale of Our War exhibit at the Te Papa National Museum of New Zealand. Access to the Te Papa Museum and the Gallipoli exhibit is free. However, for a small fee, you can get into the Gallipoli exhibit about 30 minutes before the rest of the museum opens. So I arrived at Te Papa Museum museum at about 9:30, and it turned out that I was the only one who had signed up for this tour that day, so I had the Gallipoli exhibit all to myself for about 30 minutes.
But our chief executive was a World War I writer, and he wanted to build a Gallipoli cliff up there. Health and safety and Osh said it's not happening. So we turned to Sir Richard Taylor of Weta Workshop. And Richard brought the idea of a play on the word scale. The scale of our war. So the scale of our war is 2.4 to 1. And their attention to detail is just stunning. All the leather work that they learned doing Lord of the Ring and the Hobbits is just beautifully executed there. Your grandfather's binocular case
Oh my.
and that one have exactly the same number of stitches.
Oh my.
And Richard is terrified that some military expert's going to come along and say, oh no, we never had fabric like that. You know, ours was such and such, and so it has to be such and such, even on a greater scale. To do this, you're going to have to create fabric, so you're going to have to weave on a bigger loom to create this thickness of fabric. Everything is perfect in its dimensionality, if you like. So this thing could take 3,300 hours to create.
Oh my.
This man, Spencer Westmacott, was one of the first New Zealanders ashore, and his total involvement in the war was about 2 hours. Before he shot through the shoulder up there, you see?
Oh yeah.
His whole shoulder joint is completely exploded. So he's back down to the beach, evacuated out to a ship, over the horizon back to Egypt, and he lies on a hospital gurney in gangrene for the next 12 days, so his arm has to be amputated. The fact was, the Australians and New Zealanders were dumped at the wrong place. In the darkness, the Australians were dumped here on what is now Anzac Cove, and then the New Zealanders followed in at about 10 o'clock in the morning and went, well, that must be it. Boatload after boatload, our boys are being dumped here, when in fact they should have been dumped about 1.4 miles back this way at Gabatepe. From the very start, see this impossibly steep terrain behind them? This is going to be their problem. And in fact, the whole 8 months is spent between here and here.
Oh goodness.
The other enemy, apart from him, he's Mustafa Kemal, that's Ataturk, the leader of the Ottomans. The other enemy is disease. You're going to get dysentery, diarrhea, typhus, cholera. Later on you're going to get pneumonia or even frostbite by the end of it. Dreadful heat at the beginning, snow at the end. This was everything that could go wrong is going to go wrong. And that applied to the Turks as well.
When the Anzac forces began to evacuate Turkey in mid to late December of 1915, they rigged up their muskets with 2 pails of water. They poked holes in the bottom of one of the pails, so water from the first pail would drip slowly down into the second pail, and when the second pail got heavy enough, it would fire their musket, giving the illusion that there were still troops hiding out in the fortress.
New Zealand and Australia recognize April 25th as Anzac Day to commemorate the landing on Gallipoli. Since then, it has become kind of a general Memorial Day. After my early access Gallipoli tour, I went back to the information desk to meet up with another docent who took me on a museum highlights tour around Te Papa Museum. As the National Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa encompasses the entire history of New Zealand. It was a way to honor the Maori heritage of Aotearoa, New Zealand. The museum has built its own marae on the top floor of the museum. Much like the Tahitian marae, the marae was a meeting house for religious services, welcome ceremonies, or just celebrations. Unlike the Tahitian marae, the Maori marae are enclosed structures. As the National Museum of New Zealand, they wanted to incorporate legends and stories from all of the different tribes of the Maori people across New Zealand in their marae. But their marae also depicts events from modern New Zealand history, such as the first women voters, the armed forces and the Gallipoli invasion, and the film industry. Like many museums, the first main exhibit in the Museum Te Papa is about the creation of New Zealand. From an evolutionary standpoint, the story goes that New Zealand broke off from the rest of Pangaea, and then it sank into the ocean, and then a couple million years later it rose back out of the ocean and became the volcanic islands that it is today. The museum also has exhibits on the native species of New Zealand, some of which, like the giant moa, are extinct today. The moa were 9-foot tall ostrich-like bird, and their primary predator was a giant hawk. So when the giant moa became extinct, the eagles also became extinct because they no longer had their primary food source. And then, of course, there is the kiwi. And I did get to see some kiwis in the wild, which I'll talk about in a minute. The museum also houses several Maori artifacts, such as a marae and other traditional structures that are on loan from other tribes across the country. And they had audio presentation that talked about what they were used for and kind of the functionality of it. We weren't allowed to photograph these, but they were still really cool to see. The museum also has an exhibit on the Treaty of Waitangi, which was a contract of sorts between the colonizing British and the Maori people. The main purpose of the Treaty of Waitangi was to ensure that the colonizing British and the Maori people would live together in relative peace and work together to develop New Zealand as a country. There is, however, some controversy about the way the document is written and the exact translation of the document, which has made it difficult to interpret the treaty and continues to undermine its effects. This is partially due to the fact that some of the Maori words don't have direct English equivalents. There is evidence that the translation from the English to the Maori actually worded it a lot in the British occupiers' favor. The other somewhat fishy thing is they didn't go out and collect signatures from all of the tribal leaders of the Maori people. The signatures of the Maori chiefs are mainly focused on North Island, with only a small number of tribal leaders on South Island who signed the document, leaving vast numbers of people on South Island unaware that they were even British citizens. The museum also has some really interesting exhibits on immigration into New Zealand and the Polynesian art of the Maori people. However, by the end of this tour, my cold was kind of starting to act up again, so I grabbed an Uber back to my hotel and took a brief nap. That afternoon, I was feeling a bit better, so I decided to pay a visit to the Zealandia Eco Sanctuary. As its name implies, the Zealandia Eco Sanctuary is a wildlife reserve that is dedicated to preserving the natural flora and fauna of New Zealand from other predators. Many pest creatures have been introduced into New Zealand, such as the possum, the stoat, Polynesian rats, even reindeer are considered a pest creature. And because these creatures didn't have any natural predators, they decimated the natural bird population. Cats and dogs would kill birds, rats, ferrets, and stoats would climb into the nests and eat the eggs. The reindeer would eat away at the natural flora. Even to this day, New Zealand is still working to eradicate these pest creatures from the country and rebuild their natural flora and fauna. And places like the Zealandia Eco Sanctuary are really cool because they're working really hard to preserve what is left of their native plants and animals. It's not like a traditional zoo where all of the animals are safely kept in individual cages. It's an open range with a walking path through it, and the animals are able to hide and nest and just be themselves in essentially their natural habitat. You can get to the Zealandia Eco Sanctuary by taking the Wellington cable car from downtown up the hill and then catching a bus. But just my luck, the Wellington cable car was closed for repair all that week. Lucky for me, however, there was a van from Zealandia that picked people up at a stop close to the Te Papa Museum. It's a peaceful place with a lake and some walking trails and signage explaining the history of these native creatures. It's far away enough from the city that you're not disturbed by road noise or just general city bustle. They're totally okay with you bringing a lunch in and eating in the sanctuary. There is a list of things that they don't let into the park, so if you are planning to bring lunch to Zealandia, definitely go to their website and double check to make sure that you're not accidentally bringing something in that might contaminate their eco sanctuary, because that would be bad. During my walk through Zealandia, I did get to see the two resident takahe. The South Island takahe is a flightless swamp hen indigenous to New Zealand. Due to pest creatures brought in by European and Maori settlers and hunting and various things, the takahe was considered extinct by the 1890s. However, a group of explorers later found a cluster of them in a remote valley in the Fiordlands National Park on South Island. Today, there are just under 500 takahes in the entire country of New Zealand, and places like the Zealandia Eco Sanctuary are working to slowly rebuild the takahe population. The tuatara is a lizard-like creature that looks like a lizard and is often mistaken for a lizard, but they actually belong to a specific order that mainly comprised of dinosaurs. Rhynchocephalia? I'm going to put it here because I'm not really sure how to pronounce it. The tuatara is the only surviving member of this order and is considered to be a living dinosaur. I also got to see a tui, which is a native bird of New Zealand that has a little puff under its chin. That's actually a second voice box. So tui actually have two different bird calls. At this point, it was starting to get later in the day, and New Zealandia was going to be closing soon, but I'd also learned that they do Zealandia by night tours. On these tours, a guide takes you out into Zealandia after the sun goes down. Everybody has a little red flashlight, and you go around and see nocturnal creatures that you don't get to see during the day. And despite my cold, I said, what the heck, when in New Zealand? So later that night, I returned to Zealandia Eco Sanctuary for the Zealandia by Night tour. Our guide's name was Monica, and she was very knowledgeable and passionate about the native birds and animals of New Zealand. And our wildlife spotter was a volunteer named Heather, who went a little bit ahead of us and would radio back if she saw something so we could kind of know what we were looking for as we were going. The two of them took us out into the Zealandia Eco Sanctuary. We were each given a little red flashlight so we wouldn't disturb the nocturnal creatures as we were going. And we were each given a headset so that our tour guide could maintain a quiet conversational tone and not disturb any of the native creatures we were trying to find. During this tour, we once again saw the takahes, we saw a few other native birds and creatures and native insects along the way. And then came the moment we'd admittedly all been waiting for. Heather radioed back and said, I've got a kiwi. I didn't personally get to see the first kiwi. It kind of jumped over a tree and hid before I got up to it. I did get to briefly see the second kiwi. It was kind of skittering down a hill, and it used its beak to propel itself over a tree root and literally just like trill and disappear. It was adorable. I did, however, get a really good view of the third kiwi. It was a female kiwi, and she just kind of hung out next to the trail for a really long time. We were all going crazy taking pictures and videos of it wandering around in the foliage right next to us. Kiwis are a flightless bird native to New Zealand. They also lay the largest egg in ratio to its body. It would be the equivalent of a human giving birth to a 4-year-old child. And yes, every woman on that tour cringed when Monica said that. Kiwis were hunted by the Maori people mainly for their feathers, which I've been told are actually very warm and insulating, which is very important in a cold environment like New Zealand. They were also very easily killed by hunting dogs and other creatures like that, which has led to the kiwi becoming severely extinct. Not quite as extinct as the takahe, but definitely getting there. There are also places like the Otorahanga Kiwi House in Otorahanga and the National Kiwi Hatchery in Rotorua that is very involved in the conservation and repopulation of the kiwis. Overall, Zealandia by Night was a really fun experience. I do feel like I got a lot more out of it on the guided tour versus just doing it by myself, but it's also a really nice place to just take a stroll and enjoy nature and listen to these unique bird sounds that you don't really get to hear anywhere else. This is Mr. Ziggy. He did not get to go on my adventure, and I don't think he really wanted to.
So I'm all set in Wellington for my all-day Lord of the Rings location tour, and I realize I haven't received a confirmation email from them or anything saying, hey, make sure that you're standing out in this place or in this location by this time, which I've received with pretty much every tour I've done since I've been here. So I went to their website to see if I could glean this information and found out that there was a big storm back in March, and so the all-day ultimate film location tour had been canceled until the foreseeable future. I never received anything from these people saying that it had been canceled or I'd been switched to a different tour or anything like that. So I called and I was like, I don't know what's happening. Can someone just tell me what's happening? Very friendly guy just called me back from there and he's like, yeah, we canceled this back in March. So somehow there's a middleman booking company somewhere and they canceled the tour but never actually canceled my booking. He pulled my booking right up. He's like, I've got it right here. So he's very friendly. He's like, I'll get on your refund right away. And I was like, okay, thank you. I just decided early on that even if things don't work out the way I had planned, that I'm just going to make the best of it. I'm not going to let this ruin my day. I'm still going to go down to Weta. Like, that's not optional. And then I'll figure out other things to do. So it all works out.
One of my Uber drivers had mentioned the Beehive, which is New Zealand's Parliament building, and I found out it was about a 10 to 15 minute walk away from my hotel, so I figured, what the heck, went in New Zealand and headed out to go visit the Beehive. They never intended for it to be a beehive, it just kind of ended up looking like a beehive, so the name kind of stuck. But it's also connected to these older historic buildings where the actual Parliament is held, and the Parliament libraries are held, and the meeting rooms and event rooms are held. So I'm happily standing there taking pictures of the Beehive when I noticed this sign over by the sidewalk that said, oh, we offer free public tours at 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. And it was about 9:52 at this point. I looked at the time on my phone, and I looked at the stairs, and I said, I can make it up that in 8 minutes. So I literally ran up this gigantic flight of stairs, somehow cleared security, and made it to the lobby of the Beehive by about 9:55. And I asked the receptionist, like, I know it's like really last minute, but is there any way at all that I can just squeeze on to the 10 a.m. tour? And she told me, usually we like people to book at least 30 minutes in advance, but you're only one person, and so far not all of the people have shown up yet, so if these people don't show up in the next 5 minutes, I'll go ahead and squeeze you on. Future me editing this, I can now clearly see that the sign says they offer tours every hour between 10 and 4, not only at 10 and 4. So I essentially ran up that whole flight of stairs to make it to the tour in 8 minutes for no reason, because I could have just walked leisurely up the stairs and made it to the 11 o'clock tour instead of rushing to jump on the 10. I'm blaming the misreading of the sign on my cold. And she called me up about 3 or 4 minutes later and said, you know what, you're one person, I'll just squeeze you on, it'll be fine. So there I was, spontaneously on a tour of the New Zealand Parliament building. It was a real spontaneous treat to get to go on this tour, since I wasn't even planning to go to the Beehive originally, and I really didn't even know about this tour until I got there. So it was really a pleasant surprise to be able to do this all the way around, and ironically ended up being one of the highlights of my trip. The guy from the original tour I was supposed to be on had told me that Weta Workshop does independently run its own tours, and I found out that they have tours that will pick you up in central Wellington, kind of close to the Te Papa Museum. So I grabbed some lunch at the harbor and just walked along the harbor for a little bit, and then headed to this pickup location where I was met by another couple who were big Lord of the Rings fans, and eventually we were picked up by a Weta Workshop van, which took us to the Weta Cave and the Weta Workshop over in Miramar, which is a suburb of Wellington. As part of this pickup in Wellington, we were driven by the Stone Street Studio. I was there during the writer's strike, so there was like no one there, and our driver was like, this is very unusual. Usually there's a bunch of cast and crew all wandering around. You get to see people in costumes and with different equipment everywhere, so it's just very eerie to see absolutely no one there. But he said there is a blue screen set up way in the back lot there, so I think they're getting ready to film again, and that's a good sign. So hopefully they're filming again now, but they weren't when I was there, which is a little disappointing, but oh well. The driver then took us to the Weta Cave. The Weta Cave is kind of their visitor center slash gift shop. They have figurines that they've created mostly from the Lord of the Rings, but also from King Kong and other films that have utilized their services. There are figurines of the 3 trolls from the Hobbit movie outside that you can pose with. There's a life-size figurine of one of the Uruk-hai that you can pose with, and there's a slightly smaller figurine of Gollum that you can pose with. We had a few minutes to look around in the Weta Cave and the gift shop, and then we were collected for our tour of the Weta Workshop itself. Unfortunately, we weren't able to take any pictures or video inside the workshop. Some of it relates to projects that are in the works. They don't want to spoil anything before, it gets out. It's still kind of disappointing to not be able to take photos in there, because they had a lot of really cool stuff. They talked about the different techniques that they use to create prosthetics, figurines, functioning robots. They had a whole room that was just prop swords, prop weapons, prop robots. They had a life-size figure of Sauron in that room, which was really cool, and I would have loved to take a picture with it, but can't. And then on one wall, they had the White Witch's staff, Lucy's dagger and her vial of the healing ointment. They had Susan's bow and arrow, and they had Peter's sword and shield, because they also made the props for the Chronicles of Narnia movies. So it was really cool to get to see all of the Narnia props in addition to all the Lord of the Rings props I already knew were going to be there. As I mentioned earlier, Weta Workshop is also responsible for those giant figurines at the Gallipoli The Scale of Our War exhibit at the Te Papa Museum. So they had some exhibits explaining how they had to scale everything and how they designed everything. Each individual hair is individually punctured into a scalp, and how they collaborated with the museum to create these figures and make this really unique, memorable exhibit about the Gallipoli invasion. We got to hold different types of chainmail that were used. We got to see how heavy or how light they were. They showed us animatronics, like how they got robots like King Kong to work. They did have a room at the very end where we could take pictures. There was a guy who is making figurines out of tinfoil and plaster. We were invited to take some tinfoil and try to craft something out of it using the techniques that he showed.
Channel my inner muggledom. Well, there we go. You've got to do some twisty turnings. You've got to, here we go, get a volley in.
That's the lilac?
Hang on, we'll just.
You could take this out of the plane. Make a magic of you.
There we go. Give it a bit of a spoon. Now, be careful. You'll have to consult the Greek book and spells carefully.
And that was my visit to Wellington, New Zealand. I did really enjoy my time in Wellington, even though I spent half of it sick in bed. Wellington is a big city, but it was very pleasant. It was very walkable. Wellington is one of those places that I would love to come back to when I return to New Zealand, and I honestly wouldn't mind living there someday. It was sadly time for me to head on to my next destination, and almost time for the ultimate highlight. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again on the next stage of my trip. Bye.